And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, for tonight's weather, we have another low pressure area coming up toward the Alaska Peninsula and a trough extending northward here along the west coast. So winter weather advisories, blizzard warnings, winter weather warnings out for this area here all the way up to the Seward Peninsula. Snow and blowing snow with lighter amounts of snow across the Brooks Range of the Arctic coast. High pressure over Canada still controls the weather over the east side and central part of the state, as well as the Gulf and the Panhandle. And on the edge of the chart here, the warm front with the next intense low pressure area that starts to pull in toward the Komodorskis, or actually south of the Komodorskis, Friday afternoon. But that's going to bring good storm force winds into the western Aleutians to about Kiska, maybe Amchitka tomorrow. Lighter wind central Aleutians. Still looking at snow here along the west coast and dry over the interior with a lot of sunshine all the way down across the Panhandle. This low pressure area on Saturday kind of just dissipates and falls into this trough axis, and the remnants of the front move up and bring a chance of rain to the southeast coast, North Gulf Coast, southern Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, into southern Cook Inlet. Another low in front take its place, keeping it wet for Kodiak Island. Snow continues here along the west coast. More clouds and increasing chances of moisture, mainly over the mountainous terrain here, like the western Alaska Range in the afternoon. Otherwise, big storm out there over the western Bering Sea brings storm force winds possibly into Adak and at least good gales. Front weakening, though, will only bring some rain into the eastern Aleutians, rain and snow for the Pribilofs. And for the coastal water forecast here for the southern coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, small craft advisories, east winds 25 knots with higher gusts. Central coast, east winds at 20 knots with higher gusts. And the north coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots, small craft advisories for Stevens Passage, north winds at 25 knots. Clarence Strait looking at north winds at about 15 knots with seas around 4 feet. And then for Saturday, for the south coast here, the Panhandle, east winds 25 knots with higher gusts. And for the central coast, east 20 knots, north coast, east to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, north winds at 20 knots for Saturday. Clarence Strait, southeast at 20 with 4-foot seas. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast tomorrow, east winds 20 to 25 knots, northeast 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, winds northeast at about 15 knots. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, and east winds 40 knots for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay. And for Saturday, gale warnings continue for the Barren Islands, east at about 35 knots, seas 18 feet, northeast 30 knots now for Kamishak Bay, Cook Inlet, north winds 20 to 25 knots, northeast at 10 for Prince William Sound. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, east-northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east winds 35 knots for Friday, east at 30 knots for Bristol Bay, northwest 25 for the Alaska Peninsula. And then for the day on Saturday, west-southwest winds 15 knots for the peninsula, east at 20 for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots with the gales in Shelikof Strait. And for the Fox Islands tomorrow, northwest winds 30 knots. Adak and Atka, variable winds at 20 knots, seas at about 6 feet. And then gale warnings coming into Amchitka, Alaska, maybe storm warnings, 45 knot winds from the southwest. Cover it pretty good now, but good storms in toward Kiska to Shemya, southeast at 50 knots. And then for Saturday, west-southwest winds 50 to 55 knots into Amchitka Island, westward to Shemya and Attu, and 35 to 40 knot winds, probably is good for now for the central Aleutian areas, and southwest 30 knots or less for the Fox Islands. And for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, east winds 30 knots for Saturday. Gale warnings for the Yukon Delta coast, north at 35 knots. St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 35 knots. Norton Sound, northeast at 25. And for the Pribilofs, northwest winds 30 knots, northeast at 30 for St. Matthew Island with 7-foot seas. And then for Saturday, St. Paul and St. George, south winds at 25, east 25, St. Matthew Island. Southwest coast here, southeasterlies at 20 knots, 15 knot winds from the southeast St. Lawrence Island, east 15 for Norton Sound. And pretty light winds for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow out of the west and northwest. 10 knots or so, northwest 10 for the central coast, and 15 knots out of the northeast for the western Arctic coast. And the Chukchi Sea looking at north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And then for Saturday, Chukchi Sea still north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. Brisk wind advisories now for the western Arctic coast, northeast at 25 knots. And for the remainder of the Arctic coast up here, east to northeast winds at 15 knots.